Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch. This is a quote. We've lost the right to call ourselves Americans. Today, for the rest of the world, America means nothing but the United States. We inhabit, at best, a sub-America, a second-class America of confused identity. That was from the late and great historian and poet Eduardo Galeano of Uruguay. I found that quote in a new book that's called América, A New History of the World. It is written by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Greg Grandin, who teaches at Yale University, and he now joins us to talk about this history. Greg Grandin, it is a great pleasure, sir, to see you again, and thank you for taking this time.
Oh, anytime. It's always great to speak with you, Mitch.
And I always enjoy being able to start any show with a quote from Eduardo Galeano. And, and it's funny, this term America, and this is sort of on the surface of what you get at in this book that we're going to dive into. But the way we use the word America has been controversial for a long time. I'm aware, I think most people today are aware, that we're not the only Americans. I studied when I was a younger man in Mexico. My classmates made sure I knew they were Americans too, right? Todos somos Americanos. And yet I'll still find myself now and then using the word American, and I feel a cringe when I do it, but I'm like, I just don't know a better word. I could try gringo, but that wouldn't be appropriate in a formal setting. And so this is something that's always been out there and that you hear come up. And what I didn't realize is sort of the history behind how we here in the United States started calling ourselves exclusively Americans and how that was received by others across the continent. Can you tell me about the history just of the word itself?
Well, the word itself comes from America, Vespucci, the Italian map maker, and it was just one of those freaks of accidents of history that it came to refer to all of the New World. For a while, the New World was called the Indies, the Antilles. There were other names for it, El Mundo Nuevo, the New World. But America was settled on fairly early by the Spanish. Sometimes it was used in the plural, Las Americas, but mostly it was America. Often concurrently with Indies, based on the idea that Christopher Columbus insisted that he had sailed to India and China and not discovered new land, not found new land. But it's really during the Wars of Independence, both North America and South America, that it becomes politicized in the ways that you're talking about it. I think Cotton Mather was the first person to say, to identify as an American in a proud kind of meaningful way. I that am an American, and he did so against a kind of rising theology that argued that the Americas were a place of damnation, ruled by Satan, and there were Mather and other Puritans argued that no, on the contrary, this New Jerusalem, second Jerusalem, the second coming of Christ would actually occur in the Americas. The final battle and redemption of humanity would take place in the Americas. Samuel Sewall, who was a Puritan judge who presided over the Salem witch trials, the only one to actually repent and to truly repent for sending so many people to their death in the Salem witch trials, thought that the New Jerusalem would be raised where Mexico City was. They thought it was a kind of center of the world kind of thing, in the sense that it was in Middle America, and they identified it as geographically the middle of the world. So it made sense that Christ would found his second coming there. But then as the movement towards Republican revolution secularized, the name America, it continued to refer to both things. One, all of the Americas. So, as you said, Venezuelans and Colombians and Chilenos and Mexicanos, they understood themselves as Americans. Our beloved America, Nuestra America. And North Americans who led the first Republican Revolution from the United States, they used it both ways. They began to use it to refer to their country, to that little slip of land between the Mississippi and the Atlantic that they wrested from Great Britain, and all of the Americas. And sometimes in that second usage, there was this implication that soon all of the Americas will belong to America, as they moved across the continent. There was, but there was you could. I do a little bit of work on dictionaries and the usage of America. It's really not until um, the 1820s, 1830s that in English, America starts to refer specifically to the United States and not hold this kind of ambiguous kind of, yes, it's the United States, but it's also the Americas. And over time, that obviously becomes very politicized in different ways. On the one hand, you have American people from the United States who call themselves Americans because, like you said, whoa, what a, I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright thought we should call ourselves Usona, United States of North America. Thought that then we should call ourselves Usonans. That was Frank Lloyd Wright. Um, Others, more racist, Washington Irving actually was quite aware of this kind of double nature use of the word America. He didn't like to be called American because he thought if he was introduced as an American in France, say, people might mistake him for a Mexican. So he thought the name of the country should be Appalachia or something like that, something distinct. But obviously it wasn't. So this goes on for a long time, and it gets politicized in different ways. The conservative French monarchist Joseph de Maistre, anti-revolutionary, anti-modernist, thought, obviously anti-republican, thought that that there was no content to the United States because it didn't have its own name. It only had adjectives, and for a long time, people in Latin America, before it became politicized in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, as the United States started becoming more territorially aggressive, Simón Bolívar and others, called the United States Los Estados Unidos de Norte America, or América del Norte. They just, or even though Mexico could be America del Norte and Canada could be America, so there was a fluidity there that becomes hardened over time, and it becomes hardened in two ways. First, it's actually the Jacksonians. The Latin Americans are famous in the 1950s for adopting the term Latin, which I can get to, and thinking that there's two Americas, a Saxon America and a Latin America. But it was really the Jacksonians reacting to the presumption of Spanish American Republicans, believing that they had actually shared interests and a shared worldview, that began to harden this notion that there was a South America and there was a North America. There were two Americas. And then the distinction really comes in when William Walker, freebooter from Tennessee. Your listeners might know him. There was a great Alex Cox movie made about him. He was played by Richard Harris, and he in the years before slavery, in the years before the Civil War, he invaded Nicaragua, declared himself president, and reestablished slavery in a country that had abolished it decades earlier. This was in the 1850s. And he did so on behalf of two interests. One was the Southerners. He thought maybe Nicaragua could be annexed to the South as a slave state, and also Cornelius Vanderbilt, who wanted to build a transit line across Nicaragua to get the 49ers, the gold rushers to California quicker. So that act of conquest really galvanizes Latin American nationalists, particularly one Francisco Bilbao, who's a Chilean. And as far as we know, he's the first one to use the phrase Latin America. And from that point on, there's an increasing distinction between Latin America and a Saxon America, between two Americas. And, with Latin American nationalists understanding Latin to be a more spiritual, more humanistic, more universal, and a Saxon America more conquering, more materialistic, more capitalist, more utilitarian and commercial, and it goes on. And it wasn't just a concern of elites. As you said, you quoted the lyrics from a song by Tigres del Norte. I don't know if you realize you were doing this, but
Oh,
there's a favorite band among North Mexican migrant workers, Los Tigres, the Tigers, the Los Tigres del Norte, and they're a norteño band. They sing those ballads, corridos, and they have a song, Somos Más Americanos. We are more Americans than Los Pinche Anglo-Saxons, and so you could see how these ideas fill. This isn't just a concern of like elite activists, intellectuals like Eduardo Galeano. This is like, you know, these people are Los Tigres are singing to the salt of the earth, and it resonates.
I see what I did. As I'm writing down my notes, I put both the quote from Eduardo Galeano and Los Tigres del Norte back to back, and I confused them as one when I came back to them later because I didn't remember exactly what
Yeah,
I
no,
did.
but
So
somos más americanos. We are more American,
we are more
meaning we
American, and
represent something more. We and the Los Tigres racialize the term in a good way. Like, we are the children of Africans, of Indians, of Europeans, and that's like a condition. I mean, there's plenty of things we could critique the notion of mestizaje in all sorts of academic ways, but it also does lend itself to a generous vision that there is no real thing as such as race, right? We are all one people, all human beings are one, and Latin America represents that.
another distinction that we see is one, and this is in history, and this is a history you trace going back to the sort of 16th century, the early years of colonialization, and that is a distinction between individual rights and social rights. And you argue that the United States, through its history, developed a sense of individual rights that we largely will find in our Bill of Rights, right? It's sort of what our government can't do. Social rights, however, on the other hand, is about more of the well-being of the collective, and I think sees government to be a more active agent than the way that we see it in our rights in the United States. And I think you write that the Mexican Constitution after the Mexican Revolutionary War was one of the first legal documents that would express these rights. Can you talk to me about the difference between social rights and individual rights?
Yeah, I will. First, let me say, the book definitely makes that comparison. The sweep of the book starts with the conquest and it ends with the present, and it does look at what is and it makes the argument that what is exceptional about the United States, that is American exceptionalism. What is exceptional about the United States is the United States' relationship with Latin America. And it extends that back to the tension, productive relationship, and productive competition between the Spanish Empire and the British Empire. And it makes the argument that the violence of the conquest was so horrific that it gave rise to a new kind of morality. And we could talk about the details of that later. I want to get back to your question, but that's where it starts, and then I trace that history forward in this history of the two Americas. But one aspect of it is this distinction between social rights and individual rights. I mean, just a quick primer for those Individual rights are what are in the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, and they basically are premised on the idea of restricting state power to allow individuals the greatest sphere of liberty as possible, to possess, to speak, to believe, to assemble, to own guns, if that's one interpretation, to be free as much as possible. And they tend to be called political rights or individual rights, and the right to vote is thrown in. All the rights that allow due process and consent of the governed are often lumped in that category, either individual rights or political rights. Social rights are rights in which the state doesn't stand back, but actually steps up and takes a role in capturing some of the wealth produced by the economy and redistributing it in the form of education or healthcare or national healthcare or pensions or burial funds, neonatal care, enforcement of union rights. These are social rights or economic rights, and they entail the state to actually take action, not to restrain itself. And and most most countries of the world, if not all, I don't know. I mean, we'd have to go look through every constitution, which I haven't done, but pretty much most countries of the world and every Latin American country have at least ideally some conception of citizenship that entails social rights, that entails that you can't have an individual unless you have a society. Society makes the individual possible. The United States, as far as I know, is the only one country that so fetishizes individual rights to the degree that that it's not in social rights, except for a vague reference to general welfare of the nation, isn't mentioned at all in the Constitution. I mean, a good comparison, which I make in the book, is the very first Latin American constitution of the first Venezuelan Republic, which collapsed and Spain had defeated, but and then of course they went on and got their independence. But in 1811, it's a constitution that recognized all of the kind of political and individual rights and right to due process and right to own property that the United States' Constitution is so recognized for. But it also was very much concerned with balancing those with the right, the ability of a state to create a commonweal, a greater good, and it explicitly said that the individuals have to be balanced by society, that there's no such thing as individuals without society. If you look at the very first Venezuelan constitution, it uses the word social and society. I mean, I lost count. Don't hold me to this. You could fact check me when you go buy the book. But it's something like 13 or 15 times. Neither of those words appear, social or society, appear in the U.S. Constitution. And in fact, the Francisco Miranda, a Venezuelan revolutionary who plays a big part in the book, he has a couple of chapters dedicated to him. He tried to lead one of the first revolutions against Spain. He was a big fan of the United States. I start the book with his tour of the United States in 1783. So this is before the Constitution, which was adopted in 1789. But he's in New England. He runs into Samuel Adams, and he's like, Sam, can I ask you a question? We're both Republicans, right? We both believe in Republican virtue. But how can you have a republic founded on virtue whose laws only protect private property? And he wrote this in his diary, and Miranda did. And he didn't write Adams's response. Maybe I don't know. Maybe Adam said he'd give it some thought and get back to him, and he didn't. But it kind of gets at the thing, right? Because when you think about it, the United States' idea of virtue is the sum total of the individual pursuits of individuals' interests. That's virtue. But Latin Americans insisted that the sum total, just letting individuals free to pursue their individual pursuits will just lead to chaos, and you need a transcendent value society. And part of this goes back. I'm going to take a little bit more time and talk a little bit more about the premise of the book. As I mentioned, the book starts with the conquest, and it starts with the violence of the conquest and the horror of the conquest. The horror of the immediate, the enslavement and the murder and the rape and the burning alive of the conquistadors did in as they conquered, and then of course the death toll that followed in terms of displacement and hunger and disease. Something like out of a total of 90 million people, 90% were gone within 100 years. That horror generated a crisis within Catholic moralism that was consequential. It didn't not carrying any water for the Catholic Church, but it mattered. Priests like Bartolome de las Casas and Francisco Vitoria, came up with basically the foundational premises of what we think of political modernity, that all people are equal. I'm just going to summarize it here. It's a little bit more complicated. All human beings are equal, whether they're Native Americans or whether they're Europeans. Rulers need the right to consent. Aggressive war should be outlawed. They set very strict terms on what just war is. I'm sorry. Now, this moral critique didn't necessarily didn't necessarily it didn't do anything to ameliorate the worst of the conquest, but it did create within Catholicism. Catholicism understood itself to be universal, to represent the world's universal history and the world's universal wisdom, and that kind of moral kind of dissent and critique within its realm, right? We're not talking about the schism, the Protestant schism, which happens at the same time, where they break away and say, "You guys are helpless. We're just going to go over here and do our own thing." This was within Catholicism. It had an effect of bringing out and drawing out the emancipationist potential of Catholic universalism and humanism. And again, it didn't stop the horrors of the conquest. The conquest went on. Colonialism was established. Spain ruled for centuries. But when independence leaders began to break from Spain, they understood their break from Spain as an atonement for the conquest. They understood they wrote very clearly, and in terms that De las Casas used hundreds of years earlier, that the Spaniards came over and they lost all bounds or restraints of society. They came over like wild animals. They dehumanized themselves. It wasn't that they were dehumanizing Native Americans. They dehumanized themselves, and they turned themselves into wild animals that preyed on the people that were here. And so there was this notion that and those kind of imageries worked their way into Spanish American independence, into the constitutions and declarations of independence in the 1810s and 1820s. The idea that you need that society and individuals go hand in hand. You need society to restrain individuals, and the perfect example of what you have when you don't have that is the horrors of the conquest, where Spaniards literally dehumanized themselves, and so there was this sense that the conquest wasn't, that independence was an atonement for the conquest. Now, of course, the United States, it's quite different. The British settlers and then the independence leaders didn't think they did anything wrong. They didn't believe they were, Spaniards came. When the Spaniards came, they knew they were conquering a people. They thought there were more people in the Americas that existed in all the world. They were wrong about that, but they knew they knew there were a hell of a lot of people here. The British come over and they're like, well, where is everybody? This is great.
Because the population had already
move into their houses. The houses, because they all died of disease, an anticipatory disease, predicate diseases, and so there was no moral wrestling with what settlement meant. So people like Thomas Jefferson and the founders of the United States, John Adams said it as clear as possible. We weren't conquerors; we were settlers, and all of their grievances. They had no grievances about their ancestor settlers like the Spaniards did. All the grievances were laid at the feet of King George, and what they were doing was completely innocent. There was no sense that independence was an atonement for the settlement. So right at the beginning, there's this deeper sense of history, of an awareness of the burdens and obligations that history imposes, and so that's a big thesis that runs through the book. The way that English colonialism and English settlement, was basically an exercise in evasion, moral evasion, whereas, for good or bad, it wasn't that for the Spanish.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Greg Grandin. Greg Grandin is a professor of history at Yale University and author of the book América, A New History of the World. I find this debate that's happening during the time of colonization within the Catholic Church to be fascinating. And I've thought about this, not about necessarily the church, but I have thought about what has happened in the past few hundred years that would lead to an abolitionist movement after thousands of years of slavery. What would lead to our notion of human rights that we've gained in the past 100 years or so is quite different than, I'm sure you can find exemptions to what I'm saying, but largely quite different than, we didn't really have kind of a lot of notions of human rights in the past. And, and then never mind the League of Nations, the United Nations, these things of trying to work together. And I guess what I'm wanting to ask is, do you see this debate within the Catholic Church in the 1600s? Do you see this debate as being a precursor to some of our more modern notions?
It absolutely was. I mean, without doubt, because in two ways. One is you could see. I mean, De las Casas, gave it. It's a classic sense of every document of barbarism is a document of civilization and vice versa. De las Casas, said, after witnessing Spanish Native Americans, he's like, they reason like us, they cry for the wounded, the dead and wounded, they love their children, they laugh, they have reason, they have the capacity to possess. And, he said all human beings are one. The exact translation was all of humans' lineage is one, meaning we all descended from a common, and we're all equal. And so the idea of modern equality, in which human rights comes out of, the idea that there were limits to what a sovereign can do, the idea that, that's some of the successors to Vittoria and De las Casas, like a Jesuit, what's his name, Luis Molina, argued to the point of pacifism that no war was legitimate. Vittoria made jokes about if the Mapuche came and conquered us, so already there was that kind of Marx Brothers reductio ad absurdum humor that's inherent in a lot of jokes about war and empire, but what happens is, and this has an enormous, as I said, influence in Latin America because this is the critique. So once Latin American independence leaders begin to mobilize and break from Spain, and break from one empire, they have to immediately confront another empire, and that's the United States, who revitalizes the doctrine of conquest and starts moving across the West,
And is that what it's
taking
called?
Mexico.
Is there a doctrine of conquest?
Yeah, the doctrine of conquest. It was the doctrine of conquest. It was a principle of international law that existed and was considered legal, and um and the thing about Latin America, it abrogates, it overturns the doctrine. It says we can't doctrine of conquest can't make any sense because what happens? Like the United States comes into the world, it comes into existence one nation on what they imagine, on what founders imagined to be a vast empty continent. Of course, the continent wasn't empty. There was Spain, there was France, there was still remnants of British, enclaves. Then of course there were Native Americans, and then eventually be Mexico. But the United States revives the doctrine of conquest in order to justify its push west, and Latin America comes into the world when it breaks from Spain, already a league of nations. They come in not one republic, but seven republics, or six republics, and Brazil, which is a monarchy for a little while, and and so they have to learn how to live with each other. I mean, imagine if Argentina borrowed the U.S.'s doctrine of conquest and said, you know what, we want to get to the Pacific too. We're gonna go invade Chile. So each Latin American nation both legitimated and threatened the other. It legitimated the other in the sense that if Republican Chile can rise up and break away from Catholic Spain, then Colombia could do it, then Venezuela can do it, then Peru could do it. It threatened each other because under the old wars of law, what was to stop Argentina from saying, we want the Pacific, we want a Pacific port? And so what they did was they basically came to an agreement that they were going to accept the old. They dusted off this Roman legal doctrine called "Ut posseditus," as you possess, so shall you possess. Basically means, basically it was a doctrine of war, meaning you fought a war, you grabbed land, and when the war was over, you got to keep that land, like Israel. And and they dusted off this doctrine, but as a doctrine of peace, basically saying, you know, we have we don't like the Spanish Empire. We considered it illegitimate, but we're going to accept the borders, the viceroyalty borders that we've inherited, that we've got to deal with them. This is what we have. This is what we have to live with. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't wars and skirmishes. There were three brutal wars in the 19th century within South America. There were skirmishes. But all of those wars and all of those skirmishes were settled by appealing to the doctrine of Ute Possidetis, that the boundaries were fixed. This principle then becomes the principle that guides decolonization later on in the 20th century. But to get back to Spanish America, so all of the ideas that go into the League of Nations, that go into the United Nations, were present at the foundation or soon thereafter of Spanish America. The rejection of wars of aggression, the rejection of the doctrine of conquest, the acceptance the acceptance of sovereignty and boundaries, and more importantly the principle that international relations should be founded on the premise of cooperation and shared interest rather than mutual competition. Because not only did they have a critique of the United States' doctrine of conquest, they also had a critique of Europe's balance of power. Because they felt like, look what happened with Napoleon. The balances of power, if there wasn't some transcendent interest or some presumption of cooperation and shared interests, will always lead to war, because as one country pushing against another, and that creates stability, but that's so easily upended. All you need is a Napoleon or some other upstart to kind of to kind of overturn the system. So they were opposed to old world balance of power, realism, and they were opposed to the United States' resurrection of the doctrine of sovereignty as doctrine of conquest as ways of thinking about sovereignty, and they came up with the idea of the nation state, a nation state that recognizes other nation states and lives bounded by laws, and that was the League of Nations and the United Nations in many ways.
Even our notion of a state is modern. Do you also point to this, Latin America, of our idea of a state?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is because, Europe weren't nation states, they were empires, right? People sometimes look at the Peace of Westphalia in the 1600s as the foundations of national sovereignty. Peace of Westphalia is when basically Catholics and Protestants agreed that they would recognize each other, that they were each legitimate in terms of state formation, and they weren't going to fight a absolutist war to the death because they refused to recognize the legitimacy of Lutheranism or Anglicanism. And so, but those weren't states. Those were empires or would-be empires. They were sending out their gunboats and their ships to, create the African slave trade and establish colonies. Latin America came into the world that were nations. They had no colonies. They were nations, period. I mean, there was some internal colonialism with Native Americans, which we could talk about because that's a key part of their notions of sovereignty and later on their expansion into social rights. But they weren't colonies in the European sense. Latin America was the first continent of independent nations without colonies.
So do tell me about that, then sort of more of an internal colonization with indigenous people and the ideas of social rights.
So, as with the conquest, a lot of the high ideals weren't didn't weren't in practice. Weren't put into practice. There was a big gap between ideal and reality. Unlike the United States, most Spanish American constitutions recognized everybody within the boundary as citizens, Native Americans and mestizos and people of color. And eventually, when slavery was abolished, and in most places it was abolished before it was in the United States, African Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that racism had ended or civility had ended or feudal land relations had ended. On the contrary, these things persisted in very strong fashion, and that's what gives rise to these social movements to try to make the reality conform to the ideal. But in some places, well, in every place, the fact that they recognized boundaries also took away the genocidal impulse, because in the United States, the constant push of the frontier of the border further and further west was the main kind of motor of Native American genocide, right? That wasn't happening in Latin America. There was no let's drive the Native Americans in Colombia, deeper and deeper into the forest. But to the degree it happened under commercial agriculture, the turning land into agriculture. But in some cases, that to the degree that Ute Posaditis kind of solved the frontier question, the border question, Mexican land reform addressed the question of indigenous land, because Mexican Constitution in 1917 had an ambitious land reform that, when it was finally implemented in the 20s and 30s, returned an enormous amount of land to Native Americans. Enormous amount. The Yaqui, for instance, were driven just decades earlier because their land was very fertile, and Mexico was undergoing this massive export economic boom, they would dispossessed a good, not all of their land was returned, but a Yaqui nation was reconstituted on communal land. It would be the equivalent as if FDR had like, given the Cherokee, the Creeks back their land in Alabama and Tennessee. Of course, that would never happen, but it's just a way of comparing what Mexico actually did. So yes, there's no there's no romanticization going on about the degree to which the gap between reality and rhetoric. But it is that gap that in which the kind of politics that take shape play out, and trying to make the ideal live up to the reality is one of the things that I think has led to Latin America being kind of a place in which social movements are inextinguishable. Like they're constantly coming back and they're constantly fighting for land under the worst conditions, maybe not the worst conditions. The worst conditions are on display in Gaza, but under bad conditions.
You mentioned FDR not giving land back the way the Mexican Revolution resulted in,
Yeah.
but you do write significantly about FDR, the New Deal in Latin America. Did FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, represent a shift or something different in our relationship, United States relationship with Latin America?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, FDR, of course, he's elected in 32. He takes office in March in 1933. This is the depths of the Great Depression. The Nazis come to power right around the time he's inaugurated. I mean, there's not a sense that the world is headed to war, but soon there will be. And one of the things that FDR, if Trump's tariffs are the single most destructive decision that any U.S. president has made, perhaps the single most successful um, uh, 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 decision that U.S. tariffs that U.S. politician has done is when Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State in 1933 in Montevideo, accepts a longstanding Latin American demand for the United States to give up the right of intervention and recognize the sovereignty, both internal and external, of all nations, no matter what their size. I mean, they've had these Pan American conferences, year after year or every couple of years after every couple of years. And basically, U.S. politicians would go down. They'd listen to Latin Americans complain about the latest outrage, whatever it was, the occupation of Haiti, the occupation of Nicaragua, and they'd nod their heads. And Latin Americans would demand non-intervention, and the United States would, and there'll be nothing. Cordell Hull goes down there. Cordell Hull is not a left winger. He's on the right wing of he's on the free trade right wing of the New Deal coalition. FDR says, whatever you do, don't give in to their demands give them lights so they can land their planes at night, but don't agree to their demands. But Hull's a free trader, and he thinks that if he could establish some goodwill, he could sign some treaties, and he goes down there and he basically completely capitulates. He gives Latin America I mean, it's unbelievable. He says we recognize the absolute sovereignty of every nation, no matter their size or their wealth, in the internal and external affairs. And we renounce the right to intervention. And people went wild. I mean, there were headlines and newspapers. And Cordell Hull is a little nervous coming back to the United States. He thinks he's going to get chastised. And but FDR is a shrewd politician. He sees what the effect it has, and he embraces it. And Cordell Hull then goes on to sign these free trade agreements with a number of Latin American countries and with other countries that has the effect of of basically saving the New Deal because it kind of constitutes a new corporate bloc that is, I won't say it was progressive. I don't know if a corporate bloc could ever be progressive, but it didn't stand in the way of labor reform or Social Security. So Roosevelt was able to move forward with the National Labor Relations Law. He was able to move forward with Social Security. As long as this corporate bloc who saw its interests in opening up foreign markets, they didn't mind the expansion of liberalism at home. And so in effect, saved the New Deal, and not just save the New Deal. It began to organize Latin America to fight World War One. It tilted the balance of forces in any given country to the left or the center left against the fascists. I mean, there was a fear that Latin America was going to turn into one big Spanish Civil War. All the sociological variables and determinants were there. Landed country with a manorial caste of rich landowners who, grew fat off the labor of servile masses who had no rights, and a strong Catholic Church, a strong patrician culture. I mean, it was Spain writ large, and there were a lot of geostrategists in the United States that were afraid that first they thought the Mexican Revolution was the Spanish Civil War. They didn't see it as a revolution. They saw it as the Spanish Civil War because the government was always fighting off Catholic counter revolutionaries, and it could have been. And elsewhere, they thought that the same kind of schisms that right wing nationalists who allied with Hitler and Mussolini in Spain would replicate itself in Spanish America, but it didn't because the United States tilted toward the left. Not in every case, but there was the energy of reform and a sense that the United States was on the side of the Democrats and the Social Democrats that gave them a kind of energy that led to what some people call a continental New Deal, in Brazil, in Chile, in Argentina, in Colombia, Mexican Revolution, one country after another. They were building a social state, and advancing social rights, much like the United States.
The United States approach to Latin America wouldn't last, though, would it? I mean, I'm just thinking a decade after FDR's death, you have intervention in Guatemala.
Well, Latin America is enormously important in World War II. I mean, the U.S. doesn't have to fight one resource war. It has everything, including minerals, Manhattan Project that gets from Brazil. And Brazil's, that bulge in Brazil by Natal, it becomes a key kind of logistical supply line to North Africa and then to Europe. There was nonstop planes taking off with war material. So it's Latin America plays an enormously important role in World War II. And two things happen. One is Latin American. By 1944, social democracy is triumphant in Latin America. Almost every country is run by social democrats by 1944. And they see, I mean, just like most of the people in the world, they understood World War II not just as a fight against fascism, but a fight for social democracy. And they expected that after the war, that promise would be redeemed. They wanted a Marshall Plan. They wanted public capital. They wanted, and they were told by people like Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president during his third term, that unless we raise the living standards of everybody in the world, we will continue to have fascism. Because fascism breeds, thrives off of this, and so they were expecting. They were expecting financial aid. They were and they also thought that that once the war in Europe was over, it was time to take out all the local little Hitlers that had managed to hang on. They allied with the United States, but nobody was kidding where they stood vis-a-vis their politics. Somoza in Nicaragua, Batista in Cuba, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. They were anti-Nazi in terms of the alliance, but everybody. So there was this idea that we have to take those people down, and but at the same time the United States is switching, and it turns out that the line between fighting fascism and facilitating fascism is fungible. And so during World War II, the United States loaded every nation with enormous repressive capability in order to counter local fascists, right? But as soon as the Cold War starts and the U.S. signals that it's what it wants isn't democracy, what it wants is stability, one state after another turns on the left, and left governments fall, and in Chile, for example, a Popular Front government is elected in 1946, sounding like as if it was running on all of the social welfare, higher wages, healthcare, all of that stuff, anti-fascism. But then there's this militant miners' strike in 1948, and the government uses all of its warplanes and tanks to put down the strike in northern Chile. And the person in charge of that is a young lieutenant named Augusto Pinochet, and this is in 1948. And that's a good example of the turn. So the Cold War is a switch from the United States is allying with the left to fight the right to allying with the right to fight the left. Now, the rhetoric wasn't that we were fighting the left. The rhetoric was that we were in favor of the democratic left. We liked the democratic left. We wanted that we were against the Soviet left. We were against the communists.
We were making that distinction at the time.
Oh, they continued to make it through the 80s. The democratic left, the democratic left, the democratic left. Just like in Europe, right? The U.S. worked with the democratic left, the social democrats, Christian Democrats. They built welfare states there in China. They said they were for development. But if Latin American businesses have to attract private capital because they don't have a Marshall Plan, if they have to attract, they're not getting public credit or public capital, in order to diversify manufacturing and create higher paying jobs, all of the capital is going to go to the mines and the fields. But nothing's going to go anywhere unless workers are pacified. If they're not pacified in Bolivia, then they'll just go to Peru, and so there is no room for a third way social democratic center to take hold in Latin America the way there was in Europe, and because what capital needed was pacification. Whether yeah, so that destroyed the ability of that led to intense polarization.
Greg Grandin has been our guest. Greg Grandin is professor of history at Yale University and author of the book América, A New History of the World. Greg Grandin, that was interesting, and I thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mitch. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.